If you're in business, you probably have a website, but can your site handle your growth? How many visitors before your site slows down or crashes? What about storage and data security? From web hosting to virtual servers, Pair Networks provides the online infrastructure you need to start, grow, and flourish. When it comes to security and updates, don't worry, we've got you covered. Our 24/7 US-based customer support is the best in the industry. No frustrating chatbots or sitting on hold for hours. Check out pair.com today to learn more. That's PAIR.com.
If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcast.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and I am so excited that this is an episode focusing on the ranking of Agatha Christie novels, a project so central to the mission of this podcast that I mention it every time I do my little intro at the beginning of each episode. But it's been a while since I've been able to focus on the ranking of Agatha Christie's novels, since all 66 of Christie's novels have already been ranked on this podcast. However, that does not mean that we can't still dabble in some rankings fun. And I've been meaning to do this episode for a while. I'm so excited to finally be bringing it to you. I will be ranking the murderers who feature within the 66 books written by Agatha Christie. So this is a slightly different exercise from ranking the books themselves. And I've got some really interesting results for you coming out of this exercise. But first, I have some housekeeping. I'll start with a general announcement, little public service announcement here that I made on social media, but I may as well make sure that all of you are aware who may not go onto social media. When I was covering adaptations that slipped through the cracks a few episodes ago, I mentioned that there was a newly uploaded free version of Lord Edgware Dies from the 1930s, starring Austin Trevor as Poirot. That was newly available on YouTube. And there is another old and hard to find Christie adaptation that has just surfaced on YouTube. So it's just a click away. And that would be the 1952 US television adaptation of They Came to Baghdad. Catherine and I did discuss this adaptation when we covered They Came to Baghdad. We were lucky enough to get our hands or eyes, as it were, on it through friends in high places. But now it is available to you all, and I am providing a link in the show notes to this episode. So go ahead and click on that, and you too can watch the rather zany 50s adaptation of They Came to Baghdad. It is the only adaptation of that novel that exists, so it's very exciting that it is now easily accessible for you all to watch. So that is one bit of housekeeping. In my Sanctuary episode, the final Miss Marple short story that we covered on the podcast, there was a character whose last name was spelled ST.JOHN, what I as an American would have a tendency to pronounce as Saint John. But I know enough, especially from my reading of and love for Jane Eyre, that this name is oh so much more complicated than that when it comes to the way that it is correctly pronounced in British English. When this name is a Christian or first name, as it is in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, it's pronounced St. John. And when I was discussing Sanctuary, I said my best guess was that it became something like St. John when it was a last name. But one of you wrote in to let me know that Joan Hickson herself, BBC Miss Marple, the Miss Marple to so many of you and to me, she actually reads one of the audiobook versions of Sanctuary within the collection Double Sin and Other Stories. And this listener let me know that she pronounced this name as St. John. So that's very interesting. But to complicate this matter, I was also contacted by a Christie expert, who also happens to be a British person, who assured me that when it's a place name or a surname, it's pronounced as St. John and St. John when a forename. So I'm going to stick with St. John, but I just wanted to share that little wrinkle with you all so you could appreciate yet again what a tangled web the pronunciation of British proper nouns is. It's truly become a side project of this podcast. I heard from another one of you lovely listeners in response to my episode about Agatha Christie in the flesh. And at the end of that episode, I asked any listeners who may have met Agatha Christie in person or who might know of others who met Agatha Christie in person to contact me. And this listener wrote me the following. The subject of the email is Agatha in Australia. Hi, Kemper. I so love your podcast, being a fellow Agatha geek. How clever were you and Catherine to start this? I was prompted to contact you following your call out to listeners who met Agatha. Sadly, I didn't, but we moved to a little country town in 2020, and once people found out I was an Agatha geek, I was invited to the local cattle property where Agatha stayed on her world tour in 1922. She planted a tree here, and her host's nephew, who now runs the property, told me she performed in a show in the tiny village hall with his aunts. She remained lifelong friends with the family. I am researching and writing a short piece about her visit and their friendship, which might be of interest, even though it is a degree or two of separation. Apparently, her unintended stay near our little town was her fondest memory of Australia, or so she wrote. And I actually wrote back to this listener who replied to my reply and said that they're still working on the piece and that it seems members of this local family who hosted Agatha were still visiting Agatha and Max into the late 1960s, and at least one of them joined them on archaeological digs. Apparently, there's some family correspondence there, so I cannot wait to read this piece by this enterprising listener down under. I love the image of an early 30-something pre-disappearance Agatha Christie performing in shows among strangers, etc. I believe Lucy Worsley made this point in her recent biography, but she did press on that world tour. She made speeches. She seemed very comfortable, actually, with the public gaze. And that, of course, is something that changed after the events surrounding the 11-day disappearance. So I think this just helps to capture that earlier iteration of Agatha Christie and to remind us that it existed. I also have another listener who wrote in with yet another instance of the word pansy in an Agatha Christie title. I promised that I would showcase all of these if you all brought them to me. So here is another one. I talked about this in my interview with Kitty Murphy, who wrote Death in Heels. One of you listeners already highlighted an instance of the word in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, and here is what another one of you wrote. There is at least one other instance a decade later in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side, 1962, which I was recently rereading. Detective Inspector Frank Cornish refers to the assistant of the photographer Margot Bentz as, quote, her pansy partner, end quote, after speaking to him on the phone. This young man, Johnny Jethro, makes a brief appearance in an earlier chapter where he is presented stereotypically. He repeatedly calls Dermot Craddock my dear and is described as having exuberant hair and being almost as willowy as Haley Preston. Haley Preston being Jason Rudd's assistant, another willowy young man with long wavy hair. He's described as willowy several times in the novel, who reminds Miss Marple rather cryptically of someone called Gerald French, who had an unfortunate past that he didn't like being talked about. And I remember that passage in The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side because it did seem as though Miss Marple were referring to some sort of same-sex attraction or homosexual activities on the part of Gerald French in a rather pejorative way. Oh, this wounds me as a Miss Marple devotee, but you know what? You got to take the good with the bad. That's just who Miss Marple is. She's not perfect. I'm not perfect. She's not perfect. Anyway, thank you for that, listener. It's very much appreciated. Our housekeeping segment is now finished, and we can move on to the Ranking the Murderers bracket. So I have provided a link in the show notes to this episode to some visual aids you might want to check out while you're listening to this episode. I provided the same link on the podcast's Twitter and Instagram accounts, as well as the Facebook author page I set up recently in preparation for my mystery novel, The Busybody, which is due out in January 2024. Just real quick, that's at All About the Dame on Twitter, at All About Agatha on Instagram, and Kemper Donovan Books on Facebook. So you have a lot of different ways to access these visual aids should you choose to do so. The first visual aid is this ranking the murderers bracket that I've created, left blank except for the titles and murderers as they are listed in round one. So you can actually use this bracket yourself to conduct your own ranking the murderers exercise. The second visual aid is the bracket as filled in by me as I went through it. And I'm going to bring you through that process of filling it in this very episode. So it's up to you, but you might want to pause the episode right now and go find that blank bracket and then do your own ranking of the murderers to see how it compares to mine. Or you might just want to go check out the one that I filled in and use it to follow along as I explain why I made the choices I did. Or maybe you don't want to check out those visual aids at all. That's fine too. You should be able to get a really good sense of my process and what this exercise was like just by listening to me like you usually do. These visual aids are really a bonus, so don't feel like you have to pause the episode and do anything right now. But if you would like to, I think this is probably the best time to do that. And now for a little bit of preamble and explanation as to what the heck I did here. I cannot take credit for the creation of this lovely Agatha Christie Murderer's Madness bracket. As is so often the case, I am building off the brilliance of one of you, dear listeners, who contacted me with this bracket that I'm sharing with you now in almost the exact condition as you see it here. I made some changes. The listener actually lopped off 2 Christie titles, NRM and They Came to Baghdad. And she did this to get to the magical number of 64, which is really the number that you want for bracket purposes. It divides evenly as you're pitting these titles against each other. But I was able to add a little pre-round into this bracket so that I could consider all 66 titles. That's why we have this little pre-round here before we get into round one proper. What's brilliant about this bracket, and it's not something I would have figured out on my own, is that the rank order of the titles matters a great deal to this bracket. It's the rank order that determines which title goes up against which title. So you'll see the first ranked title goes up against the last ranked title in round one. And then the 32nd ranked title goes up against the 33rd ranked title, these 2 middle titles, et cetera, et cetera. This is exactly the way that these matchups work for March Madness, for example, or any other sort of sports or sporting competition. I, however, am not a big sports fan. I know you are shocked to hear that. So I don't really think I would have had the wherewithal to do this without a great deal of research. Maybe I would have stumbled into the creation of this bracket without the help of this listener, but it was a fantastic shortcut. So I really just want to thank this listener for just reaching out with the grid pretty much as you see it here. It made this exercise so much easier for me. I'd also just like to note that Catherine Brobeck was actually a huge sports fan, in particular, a huge basketball fan. So I know that this exercise would have tickled her greatly and been very intuitive for her. And I am, of course, so devastated, as I always am, when I contemplate her absence from anything that I do on this podcast. But I really love that my and Catherine's 6-year project of ranking these titles is being used so centrally here in this endeavor to rank the murderers. Because again, the rank order determines who goes head to head starting in round one. And then that, of course, determines who goes head to head in round two, and so on and so on. So the ranking project is central to this endeavor. I am building on the ranking that we already did for the podcast. This is a new frontier, and I had so much fun engaging in this exercise. Okay, so before we get into it, a few caveats. My first caveat is that this is going to be the spoileriest episode that I have ever done. I am not going to tell you to fast forward if you haven't read specific titles, because I would be saying it every 2 seconds. If you care about having any of Agatha Christie's 66 titles spoiled, this is not the episode for you to listen to, because I am going to be doling out major spoilers as to who done it left and right here throughout this episode. So if you are worried about spoilers, make sure that you've read every single Agatha Christie book and then come back to this episode. I just want to put that out there. I don't want anyone getting angry at me for spoiling one of these titles, because I will be spoiling almost all of them by virtue of what this exercise is. Okay, so that's caveat number one. Caveat number two concerns a little bit of fudging that I had to do when it comes to the distinction between a murderer and a villain. In particular, the Christie title, They Came to Baghdad, is very problematic here. It makes sense that the listener who sent me this bracket, when she was looking to lop off 2 titles, They Came to Baghdad was one of the titles she chose, because there really isn't a murderer unmasked in that book. People do get murdered in They Came to Baghdad, but we're never really told who did it, because solving those murders is not the central preoccupation of that very wacky spy thriller of a story. But there is a central and overriding villain of that novel, and that would be Edward Goring, our male honey trap. So I went ahead and listed him as the murderer, I'm using air quotes now, for that novel. By the same token, I have listed both Commander Haydock and Mrs. Sprott, our titular N and M, respectively, as the murderers for that title, even though Mrs. Sprott is the only one who actually kills someone in the course of the story. Commander Haydock certainly tries, though. He's an attempted murderer twice over, and most certainly a co-conspirator of Mrs. Sprott's, very much a central villain in that story. And Then There Were None presents a unique problem in that almost every character within that book is technically a murderer. But of course, the true murderer of the book is Justice Wargrave. The man unmasked at the end is the mastermind of the plot. So he is listed as the sole murderer of And Then There Were None. And then for Murder on the Orient Express, I wasn't really sure what to do, so I simply listed everyone, all 12. I wasn't going to write out everyone's name because there simply wasn't room. And if you've read Murder on the Orient Express, you get it. It's everyone. So with those caveats and qualifications, let's get right into this. I am just going to go through each of the rounds here one by one until we arrive at our murderer of murderers, the king or queen, or perhaps king and queen of them all. Okay, so we have this weird little pre-round, the purpose of which is to eliminate 2 titles so that we can have 64 titles for our regular bracket. And the titles we're forced to consider for this pre-round are the 4 lowest ranked titles, which means that we start rather ignominiously here. So first up, we have Elephants Can Remember versus Passenger to Frankfurt. And that means that we have Alistair Ravenscroft and Dolly Preston Gray against Millie Jean Courtman. Oof, not a great way to start, but I think that Alistair and Dolly are pretty clearly a better murderous pair than Millie Jean. There was actually a pretty obvious litmus test for the strength of the murderer/murderers in each of these titles. As I was listing the titles and the murderers' names as they appear in round 1 here on the bracket, I, of course, had to use my own memory to ensure I was writing down the correct people. And I'll be honest with you, there were some titles where I couldn't completely remember who the murderers were. And I think that speaks to the relative weakness of those titles. Did I remember instantly that Millie Jean Courtman was the murderer in Passenger to Frankfurt? Of course I didn't, because she's a terrible murderer. In fact, if I were going to choose another title to exclude from this exercise along with They Came to Baghdad, it would probably be Passenger to Frankfurt, because there's barely a murder mystery in that book. Millie Jean kills her husband off page, and then we see her commit murder in the final pages of the book. There's also an argument to be made I should include Sir James Cleek here as her co-conspirator, but I refuse, and we're officially not spending any more time on Passenger to Frankfurt in this episode. I do think that Alistair and Dolly are marginally better. So they win that matchup, which means that they will be slotted into round 1. Our second and final pre-round matchup is between the Big Four and Postern of Fate. So we have Claude Durrell versus Iris Mullins. Those are 2 names that do not trip off the tongue of a Christie fanatic such as I. And here, too, I think it's close, but I can still remember how particularly weak Iris Mullins was as a murderer within a Christie. I think we're introduced to Iris Mullins about 20 pages before she is unmasked as the murderer. And there's just so much muddiness surrounding her at that point in the book. It's all fallen apart. So with apologies to Catherine Brobeck, because I will always remember how much she loathed the Big Four, I am going to have to give this one to Claude Durrell, aka number 4, who will get slotted into round 1. Okay, I'm now going to start off on the round 1 on the left side of the bracket here and just work my way down which means that we are starting with Five Little Pigs versus Elephants Can Remember. And let's not waste much time on this one. Elsa Greer obviously blows Alistair and Dolly out of the water. No question. Elsa Greer is one of the best murderers in the Christie canon. So Elsa moves on to round 2. Next, we have James Folliott, aka Sir George Stubbs, and his Italian wife, who goes by the name Hattie Stubbs, even though she isn't Hattie Stubbs at all. They're from Dead Man's Folly versus Ruth Lessing and Victor Drake from Sparkling Cyanide. This is a much harder choice since, as I mentioned, this is our 32nd ranked title versus our 33rd ranked title. These two books are very much on par. They're both middle of the road. However, when it comes to the murderers of these titles, I think it's Ruth and Victor, and in particular Ruth, who really shines here. Ruth Lessing is an above-average character of Christie's. I totally remember her. Even after all this time, it was not difficult for me to remember who the murderer of Sparkling Cyanide was, so let's give it to Ruth and Victor. Next up, we have Stephen Norton and Hercule Poirot from Curtain against Dr. Eric Leidner from Murder in Mesopotamia. This is not much of a competition. Stephen Norton and Hercule Poirot are fantastic murderers. How could I not give this to our dear Poirot? And we, of course, have those pesky believability issues surrounding Murder in Mesopotamia, which I think does affect the strength of Dr. Leidner as a murderer. So let's give this one to Norton and Poirot. Next up, we've got Neville Strange from Towards Zero versus Belatanios from Dumb Witness. And this is not much of a contest for me. It's Neville. His reveal when he becomes a gibbering psychopath is extremely memorable. And even though it's a little ridiculous, I think that Towards Zero is such an excellent Christie book, one that I think should be recognized as an excellent Christie book more than it is. And he has a lot to do with that. And Bella is fine. There are perhaps even some stuck in their time issues surrounding her portrayal, as was mentioned recently in the episode that my 3 guest co-hosts did all about ableism in Christie. But overall, I just don't think that she's a murderer who sings within the canon. Okay, next up we have Gerda Christo from The Hollow versus Catherine Martindale and Josiah Bland from The Clocks. Catherine and Josiah are a murderous pair whose names I had to look up. I could remember that it was Sandy Cat and her brother-in-law, but that was all I had. So I think this very easily goes to Gerda, who is such an exquisitely drawn character. You know, there is perhaps some ableism actually on display with her characterization as well, with Gerda's. And while it's important to acknowledge that, I think that it doesn't negate all the fine character work Christie does in that book. So Gerda advances to round 2. Next up, we have Zachariah Osborne from The Pale Horse and Sir Eustace Pedlar from The Man in the Brown Suit. And even though this is our 24th ranked book, The Pale Horse, versus our 41st ranked book, The Man in the Brown Suit, I found this to be a really difficult matchup here in round 1. I could be convinced to give it to either of them, but I'm going to have to go with Zachariah Osborne just because I will always remember the fact that Christie based this character on a chemist who she worked with early in her career as a dispenser. I think that Zachariah is so creepy, and I will always remember him. Sir Eustace is a great character as well, but ultimately I have to give it to Zachariah. Okay, next up we have Robin Upward from Mrs. McGinty's Dead versus Richard Symington from The Moving Finger. And this is pretty easy for me. I'm going to give it to Robin. I know that Catherine and I are much harder on The Moving Finger than many listeners out there, but I'm not sure that Richard Symington's characterization or strength as a murderer is one of the obvious strengths of that book. I think it has more to do with the setting of the village itself, of Limstock, and a lot of the secondary characters. Richard strikes me as a weak link within what many consider a strong book. And I would put Mrs. McGinty's Dead in the same category as Towards Zero, Christie titles that should be celebrated more than they are. It was one of Christie's favorite titles, and it's really one of mine the more that I think about it. I had cause to revisit Mrs. McGinty's Dead in my most recent Patreon episode, all about Sven Yershin. I covered the first 2 episodes of the Agatha Christie's Yershin series. And there's a whole runner involving Sven Yershin in that book having to do with a play that Robin Upward wants to adapt from Ariadne Oliver's Yershin texts. And I was reminded what a funny character Robin actually can be, as well as a horrifying one. And there's a lot that's problematic about the way that Robin Upward functions as a murderer in Mrs. McGinty's Dead. He feels emasculated being the male carer for his physically disabled adoptive mother. There's Christie's weirdness when it comes to adoptive relationships within a family as opposed to biological ones. The notion that murderousness can be an inherited quality. But all these aspects of the book, problematic as they are, have power to them. I remember them very easily. And Robin, I think, has a lot to do with that. So upon reflection, he's a much stronger murderer within the canon than I probably would have said he was before filling out this bracket. All right, next we have one of our easiest matchups within this entire exercise, I think. Jacqueline de Belfort and Simon Doyle from Death on the Nile versus Jimmy Thesiger, or is it Thesiger? I don't even care, from the Seven Dials mystery. Forget Jimmy, it is obviously Jacqueline and Simon, who are one of the very, very best murderous pairs within the Christie canon. Perhaps the best, we shall see. Okay, let's talk about Mike Rogers from Endless Night versus Nigel Chapman from Hickory Dickory Dock. That is no contest. Mike Rogers is one of the best characters Christie created, especially when we're talking about late career Christie, but just Christie overall. His voice is so clear. I feel like I can see him. I know exactly who he is. I think he is one of Christie's very best murderers. Next up, we've got Anne Shapland and Miss Chadwick from Cat Among the Pigeons versus Lance Fortescue from A Pocket Full of Rye. And as much as I love Cat Among the Pigeons, I'm going to give this to Lance, who is probably one of the more loathsome murderers within Christie because he is so cruel to poor Gladys and just a nasty piece of work. And I very much remember Lance. So Lance wins here for all the wrong reasons, which is to say all the right reasons, since we are talking about murderers after all. Okay, next up, we have Lady Westholme from Appointment with Death versus Sir James Peel Edgerton from The Secret Adversary. This also is no contest. I'm going to give it to Lady Westholme. I just don't think The Secret Adversary is a very strong title when we're talking about murderers specifically. This one is a little bit of a shocker. We've got Dr. Jeffrey Roberts from Cards on the Table versus Julia Stark, aka Mrs. Lancaster from By the Pricking of My Thumbs. Cards on the Table is our 13th ranked book, and By the Pricking of My Thumbs is our 52nd ranked book. By the Pricking of My Thumbs is not one of the better Christies. However, I think that this is one of those books where the strength of the murderer is in opposition to the quality of the book. Mrs. Lancaster is a great murderer. She's so memorable. I get chills just saying the name Mrs. Lancaster, and I'm imagining her in front of that fireplace with tuppence at the beginning of the book. We know that that is a tableau that Agatha Christie toyed around with so many times. She finally used it centrally in By the Pricking of My Thumbs. And while Cards on the Table is one of my very favorite Christies, I don't think that it's one of my favorite Christies because of Dr. Roberts. He is drawn very well, as are all the characters in that book, but that is just not a book that rests on the strength of its murderer. It is a book that rests, I think, on the strength of its clever solution and its audacious structure in which we have just 4 suspects and 4 investigators. It's much more, I think, about that super band of investigators, or it's at least as much about that super band of investigators as it is about our suspects and our ultimate murderer. So I am going to give this one to Mrs. Lancaster. Next up, we have Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero from The Murder at the Vicarage versus the Honorable Elvira Blake from At Bertram's Hotel. This is easy. Lawrence and Anne are a fantastic murderous pair within Christie. I initially misremembered the murderer of At Bertram's Hotel to be Bess Sedgwick, but the fact that I forgot perhaps speaks to how much more memorable Bess Sedgwick is, ridiculous though she may be. Elvira is fine as a murderer in a not so great book, but she's no great shakes. Lawrence and Anne have it. And oh, how I've been waiting for this. We now have Jane Wilkinson from Lord Edward Dies versus Louis Sericold and Edgar Lawson from They Do It with Mirrors. And of course, Jane Wilkinson wins that competition. Is it even really a competition? Gotta give it to Jane Wilkinson. All right, we're almost one half of the way through round 1. These rounds will get shorter and shorter, obviously. We are whittling away the titles here. I hope you're all with me and enjoying this as much as I am. Our next Libro a Libro face-off involves Major John Edward Burnaby from the Sittaford Mystery versus Dr. James Kennedy from Sleeping Murder. The Sittaford Mystery is ranked 28th and Sleeping Murder 37th, but I find this to be an extremely difficult matchup here in round one. I really could go either way on this because I love how hidden Major Burnaby is as the murderer in the Sittaford Mystery, but I do think that ultimately goes to the cleverness of the puzzle as opposed to the power of his characterization or his overall effect within the story. So I'm going to have to give it to Dr. James Kennedy, who is really one of the best parts of Sleeping Murder. Admittedly, Sleeping Murder is a middling Christie, which means I love it, of course, but Dr. Kennedy, I think, really is one of the best aspects of that book. It's not quite as skewed a situation as Mrs. Lancaster and By the Pricking of My Thumbs, but we're kind of edging into that territory with Dr. Kennedy and Sleeping Murder. So Dr. Kennedy moves on to round two. And then rounding out the first half of round one, we have Josephine Leonidas from Crooked House versus Edward Goring, male honey trap from They Came to Baghdad. Obviously, Josephine blows him into oblivion, just shivs him in the side. Edward never stood a chance. Okay, let's move on to the right side of the page now, the second half of round one. We've got another no competition here to start us off. Justice Lawrence Wargrave from And Then There Were None versus Claude Durrell from The Big Four. Yeah, you could tell by my tone, Justice Wargrave wins there. Next up, we have Alfred Inglethorpe and Evelyn Howard from The Mysterious Affair at Styles versus Tim Kendall from A Caribbean Mystery. I think it's pretty clear that Alfred and Evelyn are the winning murderers there. Now let's talk about another murderous pair, Patrick and Christine Redfern from Evil Under the Sun versus Honoria Wainfleet from Murder is Easy. This may come as a surprise since Evil Under the Sun is ranked 18th and Murder is Easy is ranked 47th, but I think Honoria Wainfleet is actually the better murderer. There's so much that I love about Evil Under the Sun, but a lot of it has to do with the characterization of its central victim, Arlena, and not the characterization of the Redferns, which is good, but I just don't think it's the standout of the novel. Whereas Murder is Easy is a very flawed book, which many of you like a lot more than I did. Catherine Brobeck also liked it a lot more than I did. But even I can acknowledge that Honoria Wainfleet is one of the best parts of that book. And I can remember her so easily. Her name came extremely easily to me when I was putting her down as the murderer for this title. So Honoria Wainfleet advances to round two. Let's talk about Nurse Jessie Hopkins from Sad Cypress versus Martha Dobray from The Murder on the Links. I'm not even going to try to do that in a French accent. And I think it's pretty clear that Nurse Hopkins is the victor here. She is one of the better murderers within the canon as well. Sad Cypress is not a perfect book, though it's a book that I absolutely love. And I think Nurse Hopkins is one of the reasons that the book works as well as it does. Okay, next up we have Nick Buckley from Peril at End House versus Robert Orwell and Frances Carey from Third Girl. So Robert and Frances win, right? Ha ha ha. Of course, Nick Buckley advances to our second round. Also one of the better murderers within the canon. And I know that Catherine Brobeck would agree with me on that one. Our next matchup is interesting. We have Kirsten Lindstrom from Ordeal by Innocence versus Mrs. Sprott and Commander Haydock from N or M. Ordeal by Innocence is ranked much higher than NRM, 23rd versus 42nd, but I'm actually going to give this one to Mrs. Sprott and Commander Haydock. I can still so easily remember the moment when Mrs. Sprott kills the mother of Betty Sprott. Even though we don't know that's what's happening when it happens, that revelation so affected me that it was very easy for me to remember Mrs. Sprott when I was considering the murderers in that book, even though this too is a little bit of a tricky book when we're talking about murderers since it is a spy thriller. And I will bet that there are at least a few of you howling right now that of course this should go to Kirsten Lindstrom in Ordeal by Innocence. But I will be honest with you, Kirsten Lindstrom is one of my least favorite murderers in all of Agatha Christie's books. I think that she is such a weak character. It's one of the few times where I think Christie holds herself back from showing us who she really is and from rounding out this character in a way that many lesser mystery authors do regularly. Christie almost never did it. She almost always figured out a way to make the murderers pop, but still not give away that they are the murderer until the end of the story. It's part of why she's so brilliant at what she does. But I think that Ordeal by Innocence was a rare misstep. Ordeal by Innocence is one of the few books I had a much higher opinion of before I reread it for the podcast. For the most part, my appreciation of Christie's books only increased or was only enhanced by the close reading and analysis that I did over the last 6+ years. But Ordeal by Innocence is the rare exception. So sorry, Kirsten, Sprott and Haydock, and M have it. Okay, let's talk about Mark Gaskell and Josie Turner from The Body in the Library versus Alistair and Gerda Blunt from 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. We have a pair against a pair, and I think it's pretty obvious that Mark and Josie are the better pair here. Neither of these two murderous pairs are the strongest of all those murderous pairs Christie created, and I'll actually be talking a little bit about that once we're on the other side of this exercise. But I do think that Mark and Josie have it here in this round 1 matchup. Next, we have Everyone from Murder on the Orient Express versus Yamos from Death Comes as the End. Well, you know that I'm not a huge Death Comes as the End fan, and I think it would be insane, absurd not to give this to Everyone from Murder on the Orient Express. So that is what we shall do here. Our next duel involves Dr. James Shepard from The Murder of Roger Ackroyd versus Angèle Maury, a.k.a. Queen Viraga, a.k.a. Genevieve Brun, and King Victor, a.k.a. Inspector Lemoine from The Secret of Chimneys. Just the awkwardness of having to name those murderers is a good indication of how muddled and weak they are in The Secret of Chimneys, which I did recently revisit. I gained a much greater appreciation for that title when I did so, but not for that title's murderers. So I'm going to hand this one to Dr. James Shepard with zero qualms, since he is one of the best murderers in Christie, especially among the subcategory of medical murderers. And there are quite a few. I think he might be the very best. Okay, let's talk about another medical murderer, another doctor murderer here. Dr. Quimper from 450 from Paddington versus Clotilde Bradbury Scott from Nemesis. I just love Clotilde. I think that the character work that Christie does in Nemesis is some of her very best. I am now, especially after my debate with Dr. John Curran in the podcast's final State of the Rankings episode, I am a fierce defender of Nemesis, so I'm going to give this one to Clotilde. Dr. Quimper is a perfectly good murderer in a perfectly good book, but I think that even though Nemesis is technically ranked lower than 450 from Paddington, it's very easy for me to give this one to Clotilde. All right, let's talk Sir Charles Cartwright from 3-Act Tragedy versus Norman Gale from Death in the Clouds. Two very clever books, but I think 3-Act Tragedy is so much cleverer, and that really has to do with the motivation on the part of Sir Charles, the actor, whose first murder victim was merely a dress rehearsal for the true murder. And then we even have a third murder in that book, a poor woman who is murdered for what she doesn't know, the fact that she doesn't know anything. Mrs. de Rushbridger. Never forget Mrs. de Rushbridger. I think Sir Charles is a fantastic murderer, so I'm going to give it to him. All right, the time is finally upon us. We get to consider one of the very, 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 very best murderers in all of Christie, Miss Gilchrist from After the Funeral. We don't even have a Christian name for her, but oh, how she jumps off the page. I know exactly who Miss Gilchrist is, our ladylike murderer. Versus Rowena Drake and Michael Garfield from Halloween Party. Forget Rowena and Michael. I don't care how handsome Michael is or how hateful Rowena. Miss Gilchrist obviously blows them out of the water. All right, moving on. Franklin Clark from the ABC Murders versus Richard Knighton from The Mystery of the Blue Train. It's very easy for me to give this to Franklin Clark. Not that he is the best part of the ABC Murders by any stretch, but The Mystery of the Blue Train is not one of the best Christies. Christie herself very famously or infamously agreed with that assessment, and I don't think that Richard Knighton is a Christie murderer to celebrate. So Franklin Clark advances to round number 2. Next up, we have Superintendent Sugden from Hercule Poirot's Christmas versus Roger Basington French and Moira Nicholson from Why Didn't They Ask Evans? And of course, we are going to give this one to our police inspector murderer, Superintendent Sugden. That is not a difficult choice. All right, we have 2 more matchups, and then we are done with round 1. We've got David Hunter from Taken at the Flood versus Marina Gregg from The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side. This is actually one of the hardest decisions that I had to make for round one, because it really could go either way. I think that they're both fantastic murderers, actually, in Christie's that fall in the middle of the pack. Taken at the Flood is ranked 27th, and The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side is ranked 38th. But the characters of David Hunter and Marina Gregg are some of the best parts of both of those books. And I'll be honest with you, at first I was like, okay, I think I have to give it to Marina Gregg, her frozen look. There's just so many aspects to her story that I remember. But unfortunately, one of those aspects is the fact that, was this taken from Gene Tierney's life? And even if that was unintentional or coincidental, it's just kind of unfortunate. It muddies the waters when it comes to Marina. And I really do just love David Hunter as a character. Taken at the Flood, Catherine and I covered so long ago, but I remember him so well. So I'm going to give this one to David Hunter. And then our final round one matchup involves Charlotte Blacklock from A Murder is Announced versus Thomas Betterton from Destination Unknown. I wonder who wins here. Yes, of course, Lottie, call me Letty, Blacklock advances to round two. Woo, are you still with me? Okay. Let's talk round two. Moving all the way back up to the upper left of the bracket, we've got Elsa Greer versus Ruth and Victor. And that's just no contest. It's Elsa. Next up is Stephen Norton and Monsieur Poirot versus Neville Strange. And that's pretty much no contest. I am going to give that to Norton and Poirot. Let's talk Gerda Christo versus Zachariah Osborne. I'm a little shocked to say this, but I'm going to give it to Zachariah Osborne. That's right. Even though The Pale Horse is ranked 24th, we demoted it quite a bit in the rankings because it had been ranked much higher. And I think that was fair. I think that it does belong more toward the middle of the pack within the Christie oeuvre. Zachariah Osborne is truly one of the best parts of that book. So Zachariah advances to the third round, our round of 16. Next, we've got Robin Upward versus Jacqueline and Simon. And of course, Jacqueline and Simon win there. They are just fabulous, fantastic characters, some of the best characters Christie ever created. Let's talk Mike Rogers versus Lance Fortescue. Ooh, talk about a toxic male matchup, right? Except not really, because let's be honest, Lance Fortescue is a much weaker murderer than Mike Rogers. Good old Mr. Rogers for the win. Next, we have Lady Westholm versus Mrs. Lancaster. And I'm going to give this one to Mrs. Lancaster. I cannot believe that the murderer from our 52nd ranked book is advancing into round 3, but she is. Next, in round 2, we have Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero versus Jane Wilkinson. This is a tough one because I really do love Lawrence and Anne as a murderous pair. They're a big reason why The Murder at the Vicarage works as much as it does. But I'm going to give this one to Jane Wilkinson. She is truly one of the most deliciously devious characters Christie created. And who will Jane Wilkinson be going up against in the round of 16? Well, it's either going to be Dr. Kennedy or Josephine. And sorry, doctor, but you just got bested by a child. Of course, Josephine is going to advance into our round of 16. See, we're already halfway done now with round 2. Next up, we've got Justice Wargrave versus Alfred Inglethorpe and Evelyn Howard. And of course, Justice Wargrave wins here. He is just such a great character. That letter that he writes at the end of the book, I think really just cements his status as one of the best murderers Christie created. Next, we have Honoria Wainfleet versus Nurse Hopkins. And as much as I love Honoria as a character, I'm going to have to give this one to Nurse Hopkins, who is a superior murderer from a superior book. And of course, a rare female medical murderer within the Christie canon. Kudos, Nurse. Next up, we have Nick Buckley versus Mrs. Sprott and Commander Haydock. Okay, sure, this is very easy. This might be the easiest choice I had to make within round 2. Of course, Nick advances. We've got Mark Gaskell and Josie Turner from The Body in the Library versus everyone from Murder in the Orient Express. And of course, everyone from Murder on the Orient Express will move on to the round of 16. Let's talk about Dr. Shepard versus Clotilde Bradbury Scott. Ooh, I'd love to see the two of them in a cage match. I really wouldn't, actually. As much as I want to defend Nemesis till the end of time, I'm going to have to give this one to Dr. Shepard because The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is quite simply one of the best Christie books, and Dr. Shepard is one of her best murderers. All right, we've got Sir Charles Cartwright versus Miss Gilchrist. Who's it going to be? Of course, it's going to be Miss Gilchrist. That is an easy decision. We've got 2 more matchups here in round 2. Franklin Clark from the ABC Murders versus Superintendent Sugden from Hercule Poirot's Christmas. And once again, I think the murderous police inspector wins it. There's no overestimating the brilliance of this character as the murderer. And while that goes to the cleverness of the plot, it also, I think, goes to the cleverness of Christie's characterization. The way that she portrays Superintendent Sugden as the Inspector d'Histoire. We think we've seen this character so many times before, and we're going to see this character so many times afterward. But he's really hiding in plain sight. And when he's revealed, he's very hard to forget. And then finally, in round 2, we have David Hunter versus Charlotte Blacklock. And I'm going to give that one to Charlotte Blacklock because it's a similar situation to Dr. Shepard and The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. A Murder is Announced is simply one of the best books Agatha Christie wrote. And Charlotte Blacklock is one of the best parts of that book. She is one of the very best murderers that Agatha Christie created. All right, we are whittling down the murderers here. We are now in our round of 16. So first up, we have Elsa Greer versus Stephen Norton and Hercule Poirot. And again, I don't think there's much of a contest. Elsa is just one of the very strongest murderers that Christie created. It's our top-ranked book. And Elsa is such a real character. That devastating final glimpse we get of her when she goes into the car and the rug is put over her legs and she's essentially entombed in her seemingly fabulous and wealthy lifestyle by the choices she's made. Oh, she's just great. So Elsa Greer is our first quarterfinalist. Next, we have Zachariah Osborne versus Jacqueline and Simon. And here's where I finally part ways with Zachariah. Jacqueline and Simon, I think, are characters on a par with Elsa Greer, which is why it's going to be interesting to see who wins when they go up against each other in the quarterfinals. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Our next round of 16 contest is between Mike Rogers and Mrs. Lancaster, and it is finally time to part ways with Mrs. Lancaster as well. She gets left in the dust along with Zachariah Osborne. Mike Rogers advances to the quarterfinals. Let's talk Jane Wilkinson versus Josephine. Oh, Jane, you've finally met your match. If you're wondering what that sharp feeling is between your ribs, that would be the shiv that Josephine stuck in there as she moved right on past you into the quarterfinals. Okay, let's talk Justice Wargrave versus Nurse Hopkins. It pains me to have to eliminate Nurse Hopkins from the running, but I think that Justice Wargrave is a stronger murderer. So Justice Wargrave advances. Our next round of 16 bout involves Nick Buckley versus everyone in Murder on the Orient Express. And here is where I think the unavoidable diffuseness of having everyone be the murderer in a book works to the book's detriment when we're talking about the strength of the murderers, because I think that Nick Buckley actually edges out everyone in Murder on the Orient Express. I imagine that some of you will disagree with me on that. Perhaps this goes to the fact that Murder on the Orient Express is one of the least satisfying rereads that Catherine and I did for the podcast. But I just think there's a lot more to say about Nick Buckley as a character and as a murderer. The way she even functions in the story as the seeming victim, the fact that she has a nickname. There's so much foundational work here that Christie is doing that she would go on to use to brilliant effect. This really is one of the most Christie-esque of Christie titles. And Murder on the Orient Express is a glorious trick, but it is a bit of a one-trick pony. And I think that at some point, the strength of these murderers en masse hits a wall. And for me, it happens here in the round of 16. So Nick Buckley shall be advancing to the quarterfinals. Okay, we've got two more matchups here in our round of 16. Dr. Shepard versus Miss Gilchrist. And I suppose this speaks more to my overwhelming love of Miss Gilchrist, but I'm going to give this one to her because I do think that the trick of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, the narrator having done it, is a trick pertaining to the puzzle as opposed to a trick pertaining to the character per se. I'm really splitting hairs here because Dr. Shepard is the narrator. So when we find out at the end of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd that the narrator did it, I think this trick makes Dr. Shepard one of the most memorable characters Christie ever created. But I will never forget the way that the reveal of Miss Gilchrist as the murderer made me feel when I first read After the Funeral, and on all my subsequent rereads. It works every time. Unlike The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which has a little bit of the same problem that Murder on the Orient Express does. It is a one-trick pony. Whereas in After the Funeral, the pain and frustration of Miss Gilchrist is equally evocative on subsequent rereads. because it's consistent with her characterization from the very first time that we meet her. This paid companion who doesn't do the rough housework and who is so concerned with respectability and has obviously fallen on hard times. And when we realize that is why she did what she did, engaged in an impersonation, pretended that a natural death was a murder, murdered her employer as savagely as she did, when we realize that that was the motivation for all the horrible things that happened in that book, it makes perfect sense. And it means that Miss Gilchrist so pervades that book. Her presence, her character is what you remember when you finish it. She is that book in a way that I don't think you can say about very many of the murderers Christie created. I think you actually could say it about a few of the murderers who have advanced to our quarterfinals. So I'll be coming back to this point, but I am going to give this to Miss Gilchrist. And then our final pairing here in our round of 16 is Superintendent Sugden versus Charlotte Blacklock. And I'm going to give this one to Charlotte Blacklock because she too is such a great character. And it's not quite as powerful as the Miss Gilchrist situation in After the Funeral, but her plight and the scheming that she engaged in to try to better her situation are extremely powerful, and I think a large part of what a reader remembers after finishing that book. Okay, we are down to our quarterfinals here. This is going to go fast. We've got Elsa Greer versus Jacqueline and Simon, and I am going to give this one to Jacqueline and Simon because, well, for a few reasons, actually. I love the idea of honoring a murderous pair within this contest here that I've concocted. I think that it's important to recognize that Christie used a romantically involved male-female pair as her culprits a number of times. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I'm on the other side of this exercise. But for me, Jacqueline and Simon are the best of these murderous pairs. And I think they really are characters who transcend the story in which they're placed. I think of Jacqueline and Simon and Lynette. Yes, it is a love triangle, but we're talking about the murderers here. I think about these two so often. They've come to function as stand-ins for obsessive love, unrequited love, jealousy, rivalry, just these big, big emotions. I talk so much about how Christie writes on an almost mythological or adult fairy tale-like level. And I think that Jacqueline and Simon are two of the very best characters in this mold. And there just aren't many people who can write characters like this. And I think I'm going to stay on this point to explain why I'm giving Jacqueline and Simon the edge over Elsa Greer, because as exquisite and powerful a character as Elsa Greer is, she is very much tied to her text. I don't think that she does transcend the text in the same way. One of the many, many brilliant things about Five Little Pigs is the way in which Elsa commits her crime and the reason why she commits it. She is in a fit of pique because the man she thought she lured away from his wife, she did not, in fact, lure away from his wife. So what does she do? She watches him die by her hand as he puts the finishing touches on her portrait. God, that is audacious and unusual and brilliant, but it exists within the confines of the text only. Whereas for me, Jacqueline and Simon become these mythological figures who I can think about and even interact with outside of the story, perhaps because they're doing something more fundamental and a little more basic. But it just feels like there's more for me to sink my teeth into as a reader and one who sits around and thinks about Agatha Christie characters a lot when it comes to Jacqueline and Simon versus Elsa Greer. So they are the first winners of the quarterfinals. We have 3 more contests here. Next up is Mike Rogers and Josephine Leonides. Well, you knew Mike Rogers was going to get his eventually, right? I suppose I could make a similar argument for preferring Josephine because she really stands in as the child murderer in Christie's oeuvre. The thing is, she is an utterly convincing and therefore chilling creation of Christie's. There's a reason why she is as infamous within the canon as she is. So I think that gives her an oomph that our Mike Rogers for all his narrative prowess, for all of the power of that narrative voice and how authentic it sounds, I don't think he quite has, especially because Endless Night is, in different ways, a bit of a retread of several previous Christie novels, actually. So I'm going to give that one to Josephine. Sorry, Mike. Okay, our third quarterfinal matchup here is between Justice Wargrave and Nick Buckley. And this is probably the easiest of the quarterfinals contests for me because I'm going to give it to Justice Wargrave. There's no overstating the brilliance of And Then There Were None in so many ways, but I remember making this specific point on our podcast episode when we covered the text of this novel. The murderer's scheme here is the scheme of a psychopath. It's bananas, crazy pants, bonkers, whatever you want to call it. And Christie doesn't often create psychopaths. And sometimes when she does, she doesn't do it as well as other times. Honoria Wainfleet is a highly regarded murderer in my book, as you just witnessed, but she ain't in the quarterfinals. And I think that's for a reason. She is nowhere near as convincing of a psychopath as Justice Wargrave. Same goes for Neville Strange. But there is not a single point during the reading experience of And Then There Were None in which I don't believe that Justice Wargrave did everything he did, both as to how and why. And the fact that Christie was able to clear this highest of high bars, to catapult over that high bar, just astounds me. So that is why Justice Wargrave bests Nick Buckley, who is a wonderful character. Catherine Brobeck would be mad at me if I did not say that as she exits this contest. But at the end of the day, or book, as it were, Nick Buckley did it for the cash. Her motive was mercenary, it was lucre, and it's convincing, but it's not quite as unusual or audacious as what Christie did with the justice-obsessed Justice Wargrave. And our final quarterfinals matchup here is Miss Gilchrist versus Charlotte Blacklock. This is a tough one for me because I think I love both of them for the same reasons and in the same ways. They are both very sympathetic murderers. Even though they do horrible things, obviously murder is never okay. I, like Hercule Poirot, do not approve of murder. Miss Gilchrist hatchets her employer. Charlotte Blacklock poisons her best friend. She also kills poor Rudy Shares. And let's not even get into Hinchcliffe and Murgatroyd. But as much as these two ladies make me feel, especially in the final pages of their respective books, when all is revealed about them, I just have to say that Miss Gilchrist makes me feel more. It's marginal, but it's significant enough that I don't even have to hesitate about it. Miss Gilchrist has it. All right, we are in our semi-final round now. First up, Jacqueline and Simon from Death on the Nile versus Josephine Leonides from Crooked House. And I will be honest with you, listeners. The first time I went through this bracket, I gave the edge to Josephine. But the second time I went through it, I felt strongly that Jacqueline and Simon should win. And that is still how I feel as I am recording now. So I am going to give this to Jacqueline and Simon. For all the reasons I listed when they beat Elsa Greer, I do think that Josephine transcends her book, just as Jacqueline and Simon do. But when I think about Josephine side by side with Jacqueline and Simon, it's the latter pair who feel more well-rounded to me and just more alive, more robust, if that makes sense. Again, this is really splitting hairs here because Josephine made it to the semifinals, but there is perhaps a hint of caricature for all the believability of Josephine, for the convincing portrayal Christie manages to pull off. And I just find that I can't put Josephine over that glorious pair of lying, murderous lovers. And I should note that 75 to 90% of my love for Jacqueline and Simon is due to Jacqueline, and in particular, probably the relationship between Jacqueline and Poirot in the novel, which is something that none of the adaptations manages to capture. Probably the David Suchet adaptation captures it best, but that is a relative statement. I don't think it even comes close. Mia Farrow is doing something fantastic in the Peter Ustinov 1978 Death on the Nile, but it's not what's happening in the text. And I'm a big fan of Emma Mackey, who played Jacqueline in the Kenneth Branagh version, but that did not work for me. There are many aspects of that movie that did not work for me, but in particular, the Jacqueline of it all did not work for me in that movie. So I just want to give a little extra shout out there to Jacqueline. Okay, let's talk Justice Wargrave and Miss Gilchrist. This one's really tough too, because I just finished lauding both of these murderers, and for very different reasons, actually. I think that Justice Wargrave is in the top tier because Christie set out to pull off such a feat when it came to this outlandish plan of Justice Wargrave's, why he wanted to do it and how he went about doing it, how it was executed, and then even that letter at the end, and the fact that it's all just perfectly executed. Every I and J is dotted, every T and F is crossed. I'm just in awe. And Miss Gilchrist is a very different beast, right, as a murderer, because it's not as high a bar in After the Funeral. It's not really about the complexity of her scheme, even though the obfuscation of suggesting that a natural death is a murder for purposes of committing what appears to be the second murder, but is in fact the first murder, is extraordinarily clever. If any other mystery author did it, it would be one of their best, if not their best. Agatha Christie suffers from the embarrassment of riches that she gave us. There are about 10 books that are just a little bit cleverer than that. So let's give her due there. But the reason Miss Gilchrist is as effective a murderer as she is has everything to do with who she is and not what she did. And that just goes to character. From the very first episode of this podcast, Catherine and I set out to correct the misapprehension that Agatha Christie does not write good characters. She most certainly does, and Miss Gilchrist is one of the very best examples of that. And for this reason, I am going to give it to Miss Gilchrist, which means we are ready for our final round in the ranking of the murderers here. The Agatha Christie Murderers Madness bracket is down to 2 murdering units: Jacqueline de Belfort and Simon Doyle from Death on the Nile versus Miss Gilchrist from After the Funeral. And I won't leave you in suspense. The winner is Miss Gilchrist, for much the same reason that she just beat Justice Wargrave in the semifinals. Death on the Nile is a bit higher of a bar when it comes to the mechanics of the puzzle, right? It's a very busy puzzle, and that is part of what is also so delightful about it. It's also a very busy story that has all sorts of side plots, multiple instances of romantic intrigue beyond what's happening with our central love triangle. There's even a jewel heist going on. Perhaps, unfortunately, your mileage may vary when it comes to Agatha Christie jewel heist plots. And for this reason, I think there is a little bit less breathing room for Jacqueline and Simon in the novel, as intricately and marvelously wrought as they are in that book, when we're comparing it to what's going on with Miss Gilchrist in After the Funeral. Miss Gilchrist inhabits that book. She haunts that book. She is that book once we finish it. And I'll just be totally transparent with you. Miss Gilchrist is who I was thinking of when I thought to myself, I'd love to do a ranking the murderers exercise, because you have a book like After the Funeral, which as a book is very good, but not one of the top tier Christies. And yet it has one of the very best, if not the best, murderer in the canon. So in that Miss Gilchrist is the epitome of what I want to celebrate here in this exercise, I think it makes sense that I am ending on her. I feel very happy about that. I also love, I already mentioned this, that Miss Gilchrist does not have a first name, a Christian name. We never learn it. And I think that's fitting for such a ladylike murderer, that we simply cannot call her anything else than Miss Gilchrist, try as we might. So there we have it. Miss Gilchrist from After the Funeral is our murderer of murderers. Hooray! All right, so I have 3 points I just wanted to discuss now that I have run through the bracket that I filled out. If you are looking at my bracket online, you may perhaps have noticed that I color-coded it. Every time a murderer from a higher ranked title beat a murderer from a lower ranked title, I highlighted the winner light green. And then when a murderer from a lower ranked title beat a murderer from a higher ranked title, I highlighted it light red. And I did this because I wanted to see how the results shook out. And it was very interesting. Out of 65 matchups overall, throughout all these rounds that I did, 45 of them followed the rank order. So the murderer from the higher ranked book beat the murderer from the lower ranked book 45 out of 65 times, which means that 20 of those 65 matchups went in the opposite direction. The murderer from the lower ranked title beating the murderer from the higher ranked title. That means a murderer from a higher ranked book was more than twice as likely to beat a murderer from a lower ranked book. And what that shows is that as much fun as it is to divorce a murderer from the book in which he/she/they appear, it's extremely difficult to do so because the best murderers tend to come from the best books and the worst murderers from the worst books. We have our Miss Gilchrists and our Honoria Wainfleets and our Mrs. Lancasters. This is true. But for the most part, there really is a correlation here between the quality of the book overall and the quality of the murderer. And that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so my second point has to do with multiple murderers within a single Christie title. I found this so interesting. Out of 66 titles, we have 2 murderers rather than a single murderer 18 times. That's a lot, more than I thought it was going to be. A little more than 25% of these titles, more than 1 out of every 4 books, features 2 murderers rather than just 1. I knew that Christie did it a lot, but I didn't think she did it that often. We also have 2 books in which multiple people are acting in concert to pull off a murder on the Orient Express, but of course, and The Hollow to a certain extent, even though Gerda Christo really is the murderer for that title. So that's 20 titles. We're approaching 1/3 of the canon featuring multiple murderers. Murder on the Orient Express and The Hollow are outliers, however, so I'll be leaving them out of the point I'm about to make. I think that we actually have to break down these double murderers into 2 categories. Books in which there were multiple murders committed independently of each other by 2 murderers acting separately versus books where the 2 murderers worked together as a murderous pair. So in the former category of murderers acting independently of each other, we have just 3 titles: Cat Among the Pigeons, Elephants Can Remember, and Curtain. And actually, the last 2 of these titles are special situations in which the second murderer, I'm using air quotes, is essentially a good actor doing away with the initial murderer. Alistair Ravenscroft in the case of Elephants Can Remember, and Monsieur Poirot in the case of Curtain. I believe that Cat Among the Pigeons, then, is the only Christie book in which we truly have 2 murderers acting independently of each other as a means of obfuscation, where Miss Chadwick and Anne Chaplin are each legitimate murderers, and yet the murders are presented as though they were committed by a single murderer, or at least that is an assumption that most readers make as they're reading the book. It's interesting to me and impressive to me that Christie only went to that well once out of 66 novels. Now, turning to the 15 out of 18 books featuring 2 murderers working together as a murderous pair. This, of course, is where we get some of our greatest Christie villains. Jacqueline and Simon are the gold standard. That is my opinion anyway. You've heard me go on and on and on about them for a while now. But we've also got Alfred Inglethorpe and Evelyn Howard in The Mysterious Affair at Styles, Lawrence Redding and Anne Prothero in The Murder at the Vicarage, even Mark Gaskell and Josie Turner in The Body in the Library. Calling them a great murderous pair is being generous of me, but I do think that while they're not the most memorable, they work well as a murderous pair in that book. There's also Patrick and Christine Redfern in Evil Under the Sun. They're okay. Sir George and Hattie Stubbs, even though those are not their real names, are also okay. And I suppose I would say the same about Ruth Lessing and Victor Drake as a murderous pair. Also, I will just note that there may be some listeners out there who might prefer me to list a murderous pair for Endless Night, in that Mike Rogers and Greta Anderson work together. But since Mike kills Greta in the end, I think this ultimately puts her in the victim category, making Mike the sole murderer of the book. Of course, for every stupendous murderous pair, we have a not so great murderous pair. Catherine Martindale and Josiah Bland from The Clocks, Robert Orwell and Frances Carey from Third Girl, Roger Bassington French and Moira Nicholson from Why Didn't They Ask Evans, Rowena Drake and Michael Garfield from Halloween Party, Alistair and Gerda Blunt from 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, Angèle Maury, I'm not going to go through her aliases, and King Victor in The Secret of Chimneys, Commander Haydock and Mrs. Sprott in NRM. But did you notice something that all these murderous pairs I mentioned, both great and not so great, had in common? They were all male-female pairs. And this is due to the fact that almost all these pairs are couples romantically attached to each other. The exceptions are Catherine Martindale and Josiah Bland, who are the rare sister and brother-in-law pair working together. I love it. As well as the pairs in The Secret of Chimneys and NRM, who are spies acting toward the same ends. So they're not romantically attached to each other. But for Christie, I think the romance was important. And, we often talk about her tacking on a romantic side plot or a romantic ending in which she pairs two characters together. But I think it's just worth noting that romance is quite central and importantly central to so many of these books. That's not a point I've ever made before on this podcast. So I just wanted to make it now. When I was looking at the breakdown of these murderous pairs, that was very striking to me. And then gold star to any listeners who are yelling at their phone or tablet or what have you that I'm missing one murderous pair, because there is one pair I haven't mentioned yet. And that would be the lone same-sex murderous pair that we find in Christie. Lewis Sericold and Edgar Lawson, who are the rare father-son murderous pair, though this biological relationship between the two men is one of the surprises that Christie saves for the end of the book. Edgar is the quote-unquote illegitimate son of Lewis. I would call Lewis and Edgar the exception that proves the rule. And the means of murder in that book, of course, required two people, because one person had to run out of the room while the other person continued talking. And unless you're going to use a recording device like, a dictaphone machine, a trick Christie had already used, you're going to need two people to pull off that murderous plot, which really is one of Christie's weaker plots and more easily guessed plots within the canon. As always, that is an extremely relative statement, and I did not guess what was going on when I read They Do It With Mirrors, but I know a lot of other people did. But I suppose that's why Christie felt the need to hide the glue that holds these two murderers together as a pair. If they had been a romantically linked couple, it would have been that much more obvious what they had done. So she relied in part on an unusual pairing here for purposes of obfuscation. So They Do It With Mirrors really is the exception that proves the rule. Anyway, I just thought it was worth parsing the information I gleaned from this bracket as to books featuring two murderers rather than just one, because they really are such an important part of Christie's craft. My third and final point of analysis upon completing this bracket has to do with the gender breakdown of the murderers of Agatha Christie. Now, I found this very interesting. I have a total number of 65 here because obviously Murder on the Orient Express is very much a mixed bag when it comes to gender. So out of 65 titles, we of course have our 18 titles featuring two murderers rather than one. In 15 of those 18 titles, we have one male and one female murderer. Two are male-male and one is female-female. And then when it comes to single male murderers versus single female murderers, I think if you had asked me to guess what the breakdown was, I would have thought that it was pretty equal. And it kind of is, but it's kind of not. We have 28 single male murderers in Christie versus 19 single female murderers. So nearly 50% more male murderers than female. And actually, the male-female pairs are, of course, a wash since there's one man and one woman within those pairs. But we do have two male-male pairs versus one female-female pair, which means that we can say with statistical accuracy that there are 50% more male murderers within the Agatha Christie canon than females. I would be very interested to compare that to other writers of the Golden Age and even other contemporary mystery authors, because I have a feeling that Christie did feature a lot of female murderers. It's just that she also featured a lot of men as well. So many murderers, so much time, as evidenced by this joyous episode, which I am now going to close out. Well, that is ranking the murderers. I'm so glad I finally was able to bring you that episode. I hope you enjoyed it. This was one of the geekier episodes of a geeky podcast that was either very much your cup of tea or very much not. So if you're still listening to this, you probably enjoyed it. I sincerely hope that you did. And if you have any thoughts after listening to me, or perhaps after having run through this exercise yourself with the empty version of the bracket I provided, I would love to hear about it. I am actually going away on a family vacation in the coming weeks. So I am going to be running a repeat episode. It is summer rerun time for the very first time on this podcast. But I'm going to leave you in suspense as to what I am repeating. And I'll do a little fresh intro for it to put it in perspective, because even though it's a summer rerun, it's going to be relevant to a future event on this podcast. Are you intrigued? I hope you are. In the meantime, you can always contact me via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. And you can find my author page on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books. I'm providing a link to my publisher in the show notes for this episode. If you would like to pre-order my mystery novel, The Busy Body, which is due out in January of 2024. I would also greatly appreciate it if you could give the podcast a rating and or a review wherever you are listening to it. And I'll see you next time. Bye.
You love podcasts, the stories, the laughs, the unexpected turns. But when this episode ends, the silence starts. Not anymore. Audiobooks.com turns that silence into your next great adventure. With over 450,000 titles, from bestsellers to hidden gems, your love for listening just found its new best friend. And because you already know the joy of audio, we're giving you 3 free audiobooks to start your journey. Imagine your favorite podcast, now with unlimited episodes. That's audiobooks.com. Keep the story going. Sign up for your free trial at audiobooks.com/podcastfree today. Because for podcast lovers like you, the end of an episode is just the beginning. That's audiobooks.com/podcastfree.